Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It's time to take your questions, and I've got a couple coming from Twitter this week. First one is from Ken Cunningham, who asks, can you run through possible scenarios in which another minority decision, as in Polyev, narrowly wins, in which the opposition might vote down his throne speech and ask the Governor General to form government? I'm a bit confused. If Trudeau only held his own, wouldn't he resign? Would he have accepted, or would he be accepted as PM again? Okay, so the way it works is that the incumbent is still the prime minister until the moment he or she resigns. And so even if after an election where his or her party does not win the most seats, they are still the prime minister until they signal that they're going to resign. So what might happen in such a scenario where, I mean, it's hard to say because we don't know what the seat math is going to look like, but in a scenario where the Conservatives narrowly win more seats than the Liberals, you might find a situation where Trudeau would go to one or two other opposition parties and say, can we work out a deal? It wouldn't necessarily have to be a coalition, which would mean that they would have that those parties would have seats in cabinet. It could be kind of like the supply and confidence agreement we're seeing right now with the NDP, where they're saying, in order to prevent the Conservatives from getting in, would you prop up my government for 2 years, 3 years, etc., in order to basically prevent the Conservatives from getting in because reasons. So that's the most likely scenario, because that's kind of where the incumbent is still in power and does not need to resign until the indication has been made that there is no possible path to maintaining the confidence of the chamber in that kind of a scenario. So if the scenario is that the Conservatives win the most seats, Trudeau signals he's going to resign, Polyev forms a cabinet, does a speech from the throne, and it's full of odious things that none of the other parties can support. Yes, they could vote it down at that point. Yes, they could go to the Governor General and say, well, this is the point where they would have to have come to an agreement first, where it's full of odious things, and then they're saying, oh, maybe we should have come to an agreement beforehand, but we can do it now. Take your pick. And then they could go to the Governor General and say, we voted non-confidence in this throne speech. We have a working ability to maintain the confidence of the chamber, and in such a scenario, because it is just after an election, she would most likely give them the chance to do so. But that's only really because it's shortly after an election. There is kind of a window in which that's more likely to happen rather than just going to another election. The complicating factor in that kind of a scenario, though, is that usually after such a defeat, the incumbent prime minister will say, not only am I resigning, but I will step down as leader. I will resign my seat in such and such an amount of time, sort of thing. Sometimes it's immediate, sometimes it's not. Depends on if he wants to stick around through a leadership process. Take your pick. Which can actually complicate that situation, because if he's already indicated he's going to resign as leader and possibly his seat, and then the speech from the throne comes around, it's odious, none of the other parties like it, they want to vote it down and form a new government instead, that becomes tricky, because do they do so with an interim leader in charge until a permanent leader is chosen? Does he do like his father did? and decide to come back for a defined period of time. Hard to say. I mean, these are all strictly hypothetical situations, but that's kind of what that scenario would look like. And it could also be the scenario where, because we can't discount this, the Speech from the Throne is odious, none of them like it. However, because the Liberals wouldn't have a leader at this point, they can't come to any kind of agreement because there's no permanent leader in place, or they don't want Trudeau to come back as that leader. So again, hard to say, but that's kind of what that would look like. But the rule of thumb to remember is that the incumbent is always still the incumbent, is still in power, even after an election. And it's only when they signal that they're going to resign does any kind of change ever happen. So that's kind of where that decision is going to lie. Our other question is from a Crystal Decanter, aka Brett Bart Muse, who asks, how do we negate con artists and conspiracy theorists if they're protected by station and parliamentary privilege, and the conned are too embarrassed to admit they've been duped, and most of the media are more concerned with being balanced while being neutered by the con artists? Had to really kind of think about this one because it's kind of the problem of our era right now, in which disinformation, conspiracy theories are kind of rampant in political discourse, and it's not really a question of parliamentary privilege around trying to counter these. It's more of an issue of trying to find an effective rhetorical device in which to do so. And part of that is just, personally, I think, being just frank and just explicit in terms of just saying this is a conspiracy theory, and kind of explaining things. And this is the part that we have such a problem with right now in politics, is everyone is so taken to heart the notion that if you're explaining, you're losing, that they don't explain things, and therefore these toxic narratives just kind of fester because nobody wants to explain why they are wrong or false or disinformation. So that's part of what the problem is there. We need an ability to have these kind of frank conversations to be able to call out, no, this is disinformation, no, this is a conspiracy theory, no, what you are suggesting is false and possibly defamatory. But it needs to be just kind of this frank and honest discussion, and not wrapped up in pleasant talking points or happy clappy pablum like, no, that's wrong, but our government is making sure that families are better off, and like that kind of stuff doesn't actually neutralize the conspiracy theories or the deceptions. It just kind of tries to replace it with their own narrative, which doesn't really work, in my estimation anyway. But that's kind of hard for any government to do, is because they are so focused on controlling the message that they want to replace the other narrative with their own, without necessarily going through the steps about why the other narrative is wrong or false or so on. And that's a real problem that nobody wants to really address, despite all of the urging that people like me might make. And when it comes to the news media aspect of that as well, I think this is a part where I think my fellow media people are really falling down as well, because of the tendency to both sides this kind of thing. So instead of saying this is false, this is a conspiracy theory, they will say, the Liberals say this is false, Liberal MP says this is a conspiracy theory, in order to say that, to not have that authoritative voice to say, no, as a neutral party in this, we can definitively say, no, this is false, that this is a conspiracy theory, this kind of thing. They don't want to do that because it looks like then they are taking sides, or they are not being neutral, or so on, which is why stuff gets both sides just as egregiously as it does, and that doesn't help anyone. It just emboldens the liars, because then they know they can get away with it. And here we are. This is what the lessons that we have taught them, and we are now reaping what we have sown, and it's a problem. And I wish I had a better explanation other than being frank, being honest, being direct. Not trying to cover this in flowery talking points and happy clappy stuff, and good news, any of that kind of stuff that doesn't deprogram, that doesn't shine a light, that just tries to obscure, and that doesn't help. So that's kind of what I would suggest. This is just my own personal kind of take on it. So your mileage may vary, but that's kind of where my thinking is. And that's everything for this week. Thanks for all your questions. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter, and journodale _no on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.